Hello, BookTube. Yesterday, Lukash at Totally Prententious made a video. I will leave a link to it down below. It was a wonderful thing in which he discusses a Penguin classic, which he discusses Aubrey de Selincourt's translation for Penguin Classics of the pertinent books about the Second Punic War by the Roman historian Livy, who spent the whole of his life working on a narrative history of Rome. Its beginnings in mytho-history, its slow growth as a city-state on the Italian peninsula, and eventually its maturing into a world power. Livy took his whole lifetime to write that book, Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city. And he poured his heart and soul into it, spent all of his time in Rome, spent all of his time at the archives, spent all of his time researching and writing, was dragged away from that sometimes very reluctantly in order to give readings of sections of the work in progress to the bookish community and to the imperial court of the Roman Emperor Augustus. And Lukash's video was all about how terrific this is to read, and I wanted to second that. I wanted to second that with a video here, and naturally the only thing that was missing from Lukash's video was an element of compulsion, and so I am hereby weaponizing his video into a tag. This is the My Favorite Penguin tag, because when I was watching his video, I realized I'm doing a daily Penguin on my own channel, and I realized when I watched his video that this is very likely my favorite Penguin classic. Not necessarily my favorite book that is represented in the Penguin Classic line, but my favorite version of that book, my favorite entry as a Penguin Classic. The only competition that this would have would be the Orlando Furioso in 2 volumes. But even there, I think Livy gets the prize because Livy is so much fun. He's such good company to read. I was very pleased to see all of the points that Lukash made, including one that has been made many times by defenders of Livy, that this is, as much as anything, a forerunner of historical fiction in the way that it emphasizes the drama, the personalities, and by implication, certainly it wasn't implication, it was a direct statement of historians for the last 1100 years, not only in those ways, but also in its fast and loose treatment with the facts. I was glad to see that Lukash didn't quite fall for that. I have always maintained that Livy is more reliable in ways. Once you understand how he's using his facts, I think he's more reliable than he's usually given credit. He has been the bane of historians forever, saying this guy had unimpeded, perfect direct access to all the archives on the Capitoline. Every book, every journal, every annal going back all the way to Romulus and Remus. And this is the use he made of it? To make stories, inspiring nationalistic stories for children? Some of that applies to Livy. Some of that is accurate as mud to sling against this historian. But there's a lot more going on here than that. And I might also point out that the atmosphere of the time, Livy was surrounded by working historians. As we know, we have quite a few of their works. As Lukash points out, and there was a tone of pain in his voice that I echo completely, we don't have more than a relative fraction of what Livy wrote. Wouldn't it be great to have all of Livy? But we don't. It may yet turn up. You never know. Technology may make it possible. You never know. We may excavate a library somewhere on the coast of Naples that was buried in a lava flow of at some point, not necessarily Vesuvius, but anything else. We may excavate such a library, find blocks and blocks and blocks of books that were burned and then buried by lava that then sluiced into every crack and hardened into stone. It may be that we can develop some sort of spectrograph that will read the contents of that brick of rock. And it could be that one of the people in that library, the owner of that library that was buried, might have been a fan of Livy and had all the works, the complete works, maybe even collected correspondence. It could happen. It could happen. But in the meantime, it's worth remembering that the environment where Livy wrote was full of other writers. This was not in this way anyway, it was not an oppressive fascistic regime like later emperors would be. Historians were free to consult the archives, to write, to work, to hold readings, especially if, as in Livy's case, the work they were producing helped to create a national mythology. a unifying and propaganda-ready national mythology, much like the Iliad or the Aeneid. And although now in the 21st century we maybe look back on something like the improving moralizing tales of Livy, or the strident nationalism of certain parts of the Aeneid, Virgil was much too smart not to subvert that whenever he got a chance. But nevertheless, we may look back at some of that now and think, well, that's pretty embarrassing. It's Soviet literature. And maybe discount too much how adroitly it could be subverted and got around by smart, skilled writers. But I also want to remind you, I want people to remember that when it comes to Livy's use of facts, when it comes to his use of those archives, these books were being read in seriatim, and they were also being heard at readings by people who were writing histories of their own, and who would have viewed a wholesale, just broadcloth falsifying of the records in those archives as maybe not duplicitous, but certainly provincial. And that would have been something Livy would have wanted to avoid. He was touchy about his provincialism. He wasn't from Rome, and his provincialism had been teased in public comments by no less a person than Augustus Caesar himself. So the last thing he would have wanted was to produce a work that people could call inept, bungling, when it comes to the sources. Often, in this volume and the other Penguin volumes of Livy, you will see him debating with his sources, wrestling with them, and coming to a judgment about them. Just because he includes some stories that he then says probably didn't happen doesn't mean, one way or another. This translation was done by Aubrey de Selincourt, and he described on many occasions, including in the introduction to this volume, the method that he took. And it was very much not a method where he was tortured under the lamp, line by line, with lexicons and dictionaries by his side. Instead, he would read in Latin a long passage or a dramatic scene or a moment or whatnot, and then he would go out, have supper with friends, walk around, do other stuff, read other stuff, write other stuff, and then he would come back and write out that passage often without the original right in front of him. In other words, it had taken time to steep and percolate in his brain, and then he would write it out. That may not be as scrupulous a translation procedure as we would like to see in the 21st century, but boy, oh boy, does it have the merit of producing readable prose, which is the only way, right? If you're beetling through the work line by line and word by word, wondering, well, what 200-year-old arguments have existed about the translation of this particular word or this particular phrase, or what about this lacunae? I should probably take a month off to study it in detail. If you translate like that, your translation will come out as pompous and wooden. And if you don't, if you try it like this, your translation may be a classic. I think the Aubrey de Selincourt translation is a classic. I have it in 2 different Penguin volumes. One is just the original that he did, and then the other, Penguin updated it. Because, of course, if you translate things like that, liberties are going to seep in to your work. And Penguin wanted to get conscious about that. So the later versions of the Aubrey de Selincourt translation, they have sort of updated and spruced and changed a little. I'm sure to the good. I certainly didn't hurt the readability. When I read those, that was the main thing I was worried about, is that the updated versions wouldn't be as readable. But they are. But this volume has been with me everywhere, just everywhere, all over the world, including, as I mentioned, when we talked about Livy on this channel, this volume was also with me when I was on the route that Hannibal likely took to invade Italy. So this is where I have my preference, and that and a bunch of other stuff that I've been talking about is really why this is my favorite Penguin. But you must have a favorite. Now, Lukács didn't call this his favorite Penguin. I'm doing that. I'm not calling it his favorite Penguin. I'm calling it mine. And I'm making that the crux of this tag, which is very simple. Whether you have a lot of Penguin classics or you have hardly any, whether you read your Penguin classics all the time or they sit on the shelf and you haven't read them, I would like you to pick your favorite one. Even if it's a Penguin classic that you haven't read, the fact that you own it probably means something about it appeals to you. And if you've read a lot of Penguin classics, one of them must be your favorite. Now, why is that? Is it the edition? Is it the notes and the introduction? Is it the book itself? Is it the way the book introduced you to a whole world that you didn't know existed? Whatever it is, there must be a key penguin in your past, and I tag you to talk about it. Tell me about your favorite penguin, because I'd love to hear those stories. These books have been around for almost a century, and they have meant a lot to a lot of people, and they are the introduction to the broader world of literature for vast thousands of people. You might be one of them. I'd like to hear it if you are. So you consider yourself tagged to tell me about your favorite penguin. And I will leave a link to Lukash's video down below, but I'm going to wrap this up for now because that's 2 barrels of penguin chat today. That's a little bit much. But I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.